Hey leader, and welcome to episode number 308 of the L3 Leadership Podcast, where we are obsessed with helping you grow to your maximum potential and to maximize the impact of your leadership. My name is Doug Smith, and I am your host, and today's episode is brought to you by my friends at Baratung Advisors. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here, and I hope that you'll enjoy our content and become a subscriber. Know that you can also watch all of our episodes over on our YouTube channel as well, so make sure that you check that out and subscribe. And if you've been listening to us for a while and have been impacted by the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you would leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever app you listen to podcasts through. That really does help us reach more leaders, which is our whole goal here at L3 Leadership. And in today's episode, you're in for a personal lesson from me on everything that I've learned from podcasting and producing over 300 episodes of the L3 Leadership Podcast. So if you've ever had any interest at all in starting a podcast, or you have a podcast and want to improve it, I basically share everything that I would want someone to tell me if I were starting one. So I think this will add a lot of value to you podcasters. And even if you don't have a podcast, if you want to grow your personal platform, I think this can also add a lot of value to you as well. So I hope that you'll enjoy that. But before we get into the lesson, just a few announcements. This episode of the L3 Leadership Podcast is sponsored by Baratung Advisors. The financial advisors at Baratung Advisors help educate and empower clients to make informed financial decisions. You can find out how Baratung Advisors can help you develop a customized financial plan for your financial future by visiting their website at baratungadvisors.com. That's BERATUNG advisors.com. Securities and investment products and services offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA and SIPC. Baratung Advisors, LPL Financial, and L3 Leadership are separate entities. I also want to thank our sponsor, Henny Jewelers. They're a jeweler owned by my friend and mentor, John Henny, and my wife, Laura, and I got our engagement and wedding rings at Henny Jewelers, and not only do they have great jewelry, but they also invest in people, which we love. In fact, for every couple that comes in and gets engaged, they give them a book to help them prepare for their marriage. So if you're in need of a good jeweler, check out hennyjewelers.com. And with all that being said, let's dive right into the lesson. Here's everything I've learned about podcasting. Hey leader, today I want to talk to you about everything that I've learned about podcasting by producing over 300 episodes of the L3 Leadership Podcast. And I get asked questions all the time about podcasting, how to start a podcast, how to promote a podcast, how to have a conversation with a guest on a podcast, etc. And so in celebration of surpassing 300 episodes, I thought, what if I just record an entire episode with everything I would want someone to tell me about podcasting if I was interested in starting one. And so before we dive into the practical things, and I have 4 pages of notes to go through here, so it's going to get really practical. I really think this will add value to you. And not only if you want to start a podcast, but really if you just want to build a platform, I think this will be a great episode for you. But let me just tell you a little bit about the origins of the L3 Leadership Podcast, just so you have context for why I started it and how we got to where we are today. When I was 18 years old, I had a mentor come into my life named Larry Betancourt, and I was interning for him at a church, and he would bring in leaders from the community to share their best leadership lessons. And he would say, Doug, if you connected with this leader, you should ask them out to coffee and ask them to mentor you and come prepared with a list of questions. And, he gave us this whole process, follow up with a thank you card. And I still use that process to this day. But I did that every month for about 10 years. And I got to meet all kind of cool leaders and developed many, many mentors who made a significant impact in my life. And I'm very, very thankful for each of those individuals. But after about 10 years, my peers started saying, wow, Doug, you get to connect with all these great leaders. I wish I could. And I always just laughed. And I thought, well, you could. And I would ask them, I said, have you ever asked a leader to mentor you? And they would say, no. But I saw this as an opportunity, and I thought, what if I record my conversations with leaders and make it available on a podcast? Therefore, if anyone wants to listen to it and actually learn what I'm learning, it's a great way to add value to me, but also add value to others at the same time. And so in 2012, my wife, Laura, bought me a little recorder off of Amazon. And again, it wasn't a podcasting mic or anything like that. It was just a recorder. And I reached out to the first guest I could think of, which was my father-in-law, who's a phenomenal leader. And I just asked him if he would be the first guest, and he said yes. And so we met in his basement, and we were sitting on the couch, and I literally put the recorder in the middle of the couch, and there it was. I pushed record, and that was the first episode of the L3 Leadership Podcast. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea what the podcast would turn into. but I just pushed record and published the episode. And now here we are 10 years later and over 300 episodes later. And looking back, I can't believe the doors the podcast has opened up for me, the people I've been able to meet and connect with, the friends that I've made because of the podcast, and most importantly, the impact I've been able to make. I love hearing stories of our listeners sharing, hey, I heard this specific episode, whether it was a personal talk that I gave or a guest that I interviewed, and they said that was just the encouragement, or that was just the lesson that I needed for where I am in my leadership journey, or hey, I would have quit if it weren't for your podcast. I love hearing stories like that. And for me, that's my why. And as we move into the practical end, and again, I have lots of practical things to share with you. The first thing I would tell you if you want to start a podcast is you better have a strong why for starting a podcast. I like to tell people that I started podcasting before it was cool in 2012. I certainly wasn't the first to the game, but I was early to the game, which was great because now there's millions of podcasts. So it was great to get in early. But as I just said, there's millions of podcasts now, and now everyone is starting a podcast. And so if you're just starting a podcast because you think it's trendy or you think it's the cool thing to do, I'm telling you, that is not a strong enough why. So if you want to start a podcast, you have to have a strong why. And so what are some strong whys? One, I would tell you if it's on your heart to do. If you feel this feeling constantly of, I think I'm supposed to start a podcast, I would tell you that that's a strong why. Number two, and this should always be the number one why behind starting a podcast, is to add value to people. That's it. Whether you're creating a podcast to entertain people or teach them something, however you want to create your podcast, your main focus should be to add value to people. And as long as that's your motive, you'll make it for the long run. I don't know the actual statistic, but literally out of hundreds of thousands of podcasts started each year, the majority of those podcasts never make it past 10 episodes. And that's because I don't think those podcasters had a strong enough why. Another why could be because you want to promote and you want to market your organization, which is great. But if you ask me personally, if you're just creating a podcast to market your company, again, because it's the cool thing to do or it's the right thing to do, it's not going to last because that's not a strong enough why to create compelling content over and over again. It is a lot of work putting on a podcast and producing it and doing good at it. And so you have to have a strong why. That is the first thing that I would tell you if you want to start a podcast. The second thing I want to cover when it comes to podcasting is all of the benefits of starting a podcast. Listen, there are a ton of benefits. I already mentioned a few of what happened, a few things that have happened in my life as a result. But some benefits that I would share with you are you can make a difference. Whether you impact one life or 10,000 lives or millions of lives through your podcast, you can make a difference in someone's life by producing the content that you feel led to produce. Number two is you never know who you're going to make an impact. You never know who you're going to impact. You don't. I've been shocked, like literally shocked at some of the leaders that have told me they listen to my podcast. Shocked. And I can't even believe I'm impacting them. And for me, if I get to impact one person, I can't even believe that. Like that in and of itself is unbelievable. But when you put your work out there, Gary Vaynerchuk has this great video that says 1 is greater than 0. And it keeps me motivated all the time. And he said, are you willing to invest the time to get 10 viewers on a podcast or 100 viewers? Because even if you only have 10 or 100 views, it may not be millions of views. All you need is one right view from the right person for your entire life and business and everything to change. He said, out of those 100 views, one of those listeners might be a producer at CNN or Fox News or someone who's looking for great talent. And you have no idea what doors that'll open up. So give it everything you have and just know that you have no idea who you could impact if you'll start one. 3, a benefit of podcasting, it is a great way to connect with people that you'd probably never connect with any other way. I mentioned when I started the podcast, I never thought that I would interview, the coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers and the coach of the Pittsburgh Penguins and the coach of the Pirates and Tony Horton, and some of my heroes. I never dreamed of being able to do that. But because of the podcast, I have. And so it's a great way to connect with people that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. Another benefit is it's a great way to scale your content. This is extremely practical, but think about this. I'm doing a video and an audio podcast right now. So right now, this content that I'm producing is going to turn into a video podcast. It's going to turn into an audio podcast. And out of both of those formats, we're going to create micro content that'll go on social media. So micro videos and audios to give people a taste. And out of those, we can actually take quotes and make word graphics and transcripts of the podcast. And so all of a sudden, this one piece of content that I'm creating is now turning into, 15 or 20 pieces of content that'll be pushed out on social media and help make a difference. So that's huge. Another benefit is you can monetize it. I'll talk a little bit about that, but you can make money. And then lastly, it's a great marketing tool for you, your organization, and company. That is a realistic benefit of podcasting. So those are some of the benefits. So if you're listening to this already and you're saying, I know I'm supposed to podcast, I feel like I have strong whys, I love all the benefits, here's my advice to you. Everyone that asks me about starting a podcast, just start your podcast. Just start your podcast. Stop waiting until you figure out the perfect equipment to get. Stop waiting until you figure out how to edit right and have this awesome list of guests. No. Just start where you are. Just start. I can't say that enough. This is very, very simple. I'll talk about production in a minute, but just start. Sorry, I have so many notes here. I just wanted to see. But some of my favorite feedback from people when I talk about just starting is, I've actually had people say, I love going back and listening to the first 100 episodes of your podcast because the quality wasn't great. Not the quality of the conversation, but the quality of the podcast. And to see how far you've grown over 300 episodes as an interviewer, as a production, etc., has been phenomenal. And that's greatly encouraging to me that we can always get better. And it is greatly encouraging you. And I encourage you, if you want to go back and listen to my episode with my father-in-law on the couch. Listen to the quality. We've improved immensely. And so if you're going to start, you have to be willing to be bad in the beginning. I love what John Maxwell says all the time. He said, in the beginning, you're not as bad as people think, right? And there's times where you just want to say, listen, I know I'm bad, but I'm not that bad. But he said, if you do things right in life, or in this case, podcasting, and you grow over time, in the end, you're not as good as people think. And he said, and somewhere in between those two, you should live. And I just love that advice. Just start and be okay with being bad in the beginning, because realize that you're going to have to grow just like your podcast is going to have to grow. Just start your podcast. So let's talk about some more practical things about starting a podcast. Two options when it comes to producing your podcast. You can self-produce, so you can actually do it yourself, or you can outsource the production of your podcast. For me, I don't know, for the first 7 years, I produced my own podcast. And you know how I did that? I just Googled, how do you edit and produce a podcast? And there's 1,000 YouTube videos on how to produce a podcast. There's 1,000 articles on it. And so, again, we live in a day and age where it's not hard to figure out what equipment you need to buy or use and how to use GarageBand. I used GarageBand for many, many years. And eventually I was monetizing the podcast enough where I could pay another company to produce the podcast. If you have the financial ability to do that in the beginning of your podcast, it's wonderful. If you can get to a place where all you have to do is create content and everyone else takes care, and you have a team that takes care of everything else, that's a beautiful place to be. But if you're not there, don't worry about getting there. Just start on your own, learn how to edit it. Trust me, if I can do it, anyone can do it. So be willing to self-produce for a while. And then as you grow, just know that the end goal should be to outsource your podcast so that you can just focus on creating great content. So that's my tips on starting and producing a podcast. I want to talk to you a little bit about my tips for getting guests. So here's my process. Start with who you know. If you want to get guests, start with who you know. I talked about my father-in-law was my first guest, pretty close member of my family, right? And then if you look at my first 100 episodes, the majority of those are friends that I reached out to and leaders in our city that I reached out to. And then you'll see a gradual growth into getting some more nationally recognized leaders, et cetera. But if you don't start with your own network, you'll never grow your network. So start with where you are. 2 is I would encourage you to make a bucket list of people that you'd want to interview. So, fortunately right now I'm in a place with L3 where we have an executive assistant, Ashley. She's incredible. And I have an entire bucket list in a database of people that I'd like to interview. And she just works that list and she actually reaches out on my behalf. But creating a bucket list is huge. And again, you don't know if you'll ever get them, but it gives you a target of people to reach out to. So create a bucket list of leaders to reach out to. Number 3 is ask for referrals at the end of every podcast. This is huge. So at the end of every podcast, I ask 2 questions. One I'll talk about later. But one question I always ask my guests is, do you have 1 or 2 or 3 leaders that come to mind that I can either A, use your name in an invitation, or 2, that you'd be willing to connect me with? That question alone has opened up a ton of doors. And again, if you do a good job on the conversation, which I'll talk about in a minute, if you do a good job with your guest, they're going to trust you and actually refer you to your friends because they know you're a great podcast and a great interviewer. So ask for referrals. Next, I would eventually tell you that if you're reaching out to guests, once you've built some momentum and have had some good guests on your show, you can actually leverage their names when you're asking for a podcast. So now I'm in a place when I reach out for someone to be on the podcast, I can say, hey, so-and-so, I'd love to have you on the podcast. In the past, I've interviewed leaders like Coach Mike Tomlin of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Coach Sullivan from the Pittsburgh Penguins, et cetera. And I just use those as an example because that gives you credibility, because all of a sudden it's saying, whoa, if those leaders were willing to be on this podcast, there must be something to it. There's some credibility in this leader. You know what? I'll jump on the show. So include lists of past guests if those guests have credibility with whoever that you're asking. What else? Find ways to add value to the person you're asking. So now podcasting is so popular that literally people get hundreds of invitations to be on podcasts every day. I get hundreds of emails, I feel like, every day of people wanting to be on the podcast, which really is super annoying to me. But that's a whole nother story. But again, you have to think about this. If you're reaching out to someone, especially someone with a big platform, they're already getting asked hundreds of ways. So you're going to have to think of a way to stand out. So a few ways you could stand out. One is find out what's important to them. You know, are they writing a book that you could help promote? Because it's not about them just being on your show. It's about you adding value to them as a guest. If they're coming out with a book, hey, I'd love to help you promote your book. We have X amount of listeners. I think we could sell a few copies of your book and kind of grow your platform. Could we do that for you? Think of ways to add value to them, not just ways that they could add value to you. Next, I always ask for 20 to 60 minutes. Right now, I actually ask for 30 to 60. My goal is to always have 60-minute interviews. I do like long-form content. I know not everyone does. But again, this is my podcast, and I can do what I want to. But I like long conversations because really, why did I start the podcast? Because I was having coffee with leaders for an hour and learning from them. So I want an hour with these leaders because really, I'm just viewing it as me having coffee with them, and you all get to come along for the journey. So ask them for amount of time. But again, depending on their platform, just realize that some leaders won't give you an hour. Some leaders will give you 20 minutes, though, if you ask for 20 minutes. So just try to use your best judgment in learning how much time to ask for. You should let them know, especially if people are higher profile, let them know about your podcast. You know, how many downloads do you have? Who's been on your show in the past? Who's your target audience? How could this benefit them? We actually have a one-pager that kind of gives an overview of all of that we send to the people that we're potentially interviewing. Because again, they need to know that it's going to add value to them to be on the podcast. And after you've sent them the one pager on your stats and sent the email out asking them to be on the podcast, then it's just a waiting game and you see how they respond. Sometimes they'll respond yes, which is obviously a huge, huge win. And then you just schedule it. And then I'll talk about follow-up in a minute. Sometimes you won't hear back at all, and that's okay. And sometimes you'll hear no, and that's okay too. And here's what I've learned a lot over the last 100 episodes is a no now does not mean a no later. Some of the best podcasters on the planet that I know that I've talked to said it took them 60, 70, sometimes 80 emails / reaches, touches, etc., to get the guest to come onto their podcast. Why? Because the people are busy. And so don't hesitate to reach out more than once. If you get rejected, may just not be a good time. Reach out again in 6 months and be unique. Could you do something different with your invites? Could you send a video of why you want the guest on your podcast and the impact that they've made on their life? How can you separate yourself from the 10,000 other podcasters trying to get that guest? Those are just my thoughts there. And if a guest says yes, again, for me, we send them a calendar invite with all of the information that they need to know. We want to send them information about who our audience is and who they'll be speaking to. And then after the podcast is done, we let them have final edit if there's anything they want edited out. And then the day that the podcast is produced, we actually send them all the assets, so all the micro content, all the video, etc., if they want to share it with their audience as well. And then we like to follow up with a thank you card and a gift. So whether that's a $10 gift card or just a thank you note, we want to do something just to show appreciation. And again, try to stand out from the rest of the people that are interviewing them. We want to be just seen as world-class. So those are some of my tips on getting guests. I hope that helped you. The other thing that I would say when it comes to producing great content is don't just be someone who interviews people. Produce some of your own content. So for me, I try to do once a month, I try to do a personal leadership lesson like this. And then I have 3 interviews each month as well. And why I think this is important is because it's your podcast and people want to know you. And I know this requires more work because then you have to create a lesson and it could be overwhelming, but people want to get to know you. And what's been interesting is some of the feedback that I've gotten is people have actually said, Doug, sometimes I like your own personal lessons more than I do the interviews, and we want more of you. So that's something I'm trying to do more and more of. And also something I heard Gary V talk about, Gary Vaynerchuk, he just said, for him, he said, most people can't create their own content. And he said, that's why you see so many podcasters interviewing people because they're insecure and they don't think their own content would be good enough. And so they're basically hiding behind the influence of whoever they're interviewing. And I certainly don't think that's true of everyone who's doing conversations. Again, I didn't start the podcast because of that. I just wanted to learn from leaders. But I do think there's value and that you could exponentially grow your business and brand if you start creating your own content on your podcast in addition to the conversations that you have. So just a thought. And then when it comes to the actual interview, let me give you some interview tips. Here's just my process for things is one, do your research on the person. So when I get an interview with someone, I have a skeleton list of questions that I go to. So I have my lightning round questions, which is great, but I'll basically hop on podcasts and just see if that guest has been interviewed elsewhere. And then I'll actually listen to an interview or two just so I can see where that interviewer took it and see if it went in the interesting places. And then I try to extract my own questions off of that interview. I'll obviously Google the person, look at their website, look at the content that they've produced. And then if they've written books, I do try to get their book in advance and read the book. So I actually have questions that I can ask them. So I think the more prepared you can be, the better the interview will be. And the encouragement there would be try to find questions that not everyone is asking them, right? You know, if they're interviewed 1,000 times, they've probably said the same thing over and over again. And what will be refreshing to them is to actually be asked about things that they've never been asked about before. And so try to be unique and creative. And then with those questions, after I'm done preparing or after I'm done researching, then I actually send those questions off to the guest. Some guests never read the questions that I send in advance. Some guests literally write out their answers word for word. It's been really interesting to see. But I will say that all guests appreciated being prepared with questions. And that's just a way to set yourself apart as well. Another interview tip that I would give you is don't be intimidated by the person you're interviewing out of insecurity. This is huge. Don't be intimidated by the person you're interviewing. And I put out of insecurity. Because why? Because for the first 200 episodes, I was insecure around the guests. And I'll talk a little bit about feedback in a minute. I had 4 pieces of feedback throughout my time podcasting from leaders pouring into me. About the interview that I had with them. And Ken Coleman significantly changed my life. 2 people did. I'll just tell you now. Matt Keller, who's a leader and mentor in my life, he said, I said, Matt, give me some feedback on my interview skills in my podcast because he listens to it. He said, Doug, sometimes you're so focused on getting to the next question that it sounds like you're not really listening to the guest and you don't let conversations go where they could go. And I was like, wow, he's absolutely right. And I couldn't put my finger on why I do that until I was interviewing Ken Coleman, and I asked Ken Coleman the same thing. I said, give me some feedback. And he said, and I told him what Matt Keller said, and he said, Doug, you're afraid of something. And I couldn't figure out. You can actually listen to him give me this feedback on the podcast in an interview with him. But he said, Doug, you're not afraid of what people think. You're not afraid of what your audience will think. He's like, you're afraid of what the person thinks in front of you. You're afraid of that person judging you. And he was absolutely right. And I was insecure. He said, Doug, you shouldn't be. They're just people. And for whatever reason, that conversation really, really helped me. And from that time on, I just became more and more confident and not so reliant on questions, but just realizing that it's just like I'm having coffee with someone. And just because someone has a bigger platform than anyone else I've ever interacted with before, that doesn't mean anything. They're just a person. And so just realize that they're just people. Realize that they might be uncomfortable, right? They might be insecure on being interviewed. I said this already, but treat them like you're meeting them for coffee, and just realize that you will grow more and more confident over time. You may be very insecure in the beginning, but as you grow in confidence as an interviewer, you will get better and better. Other interview tips, always provide an upfront contract. So when I jump on a call with someone, before we dive into the interview, I always say, hey, we're slated for 1 hour. Are you still good? Do you need me to end a little bit early? I let them direct. And so, hey, yes, I need to leave 5 minutes early. Okay, I will manage the clock and make sure we end early. And then I just go through the logistics. Hey, for me, I say we're using audio and video today. Is that okay? It's going to be on YouTube. Yes. Hey, you have final edit. If there's anything that you want edited out, that's your call. And our team will make sure that happens. And then we'll send you everything afterwards. And do you have any other questions? And then I walk them through. We use Riverside.fm. I walk them through how that process works. And then that's it. But an upfront contract is absolutely huge. Another interview tip would be don't get stuck trying to ask all of your questions. And again, this was part of my journey, but learn to be curious and see where the interview goes. And this is where it pays to be a good listener. And again, for the first 100+ episodes, I wasn't a good listener because I was insecure and so focused on the next question. But I talked to people like Carey Nieuwhof, and he said, I used to have, 50 questions for someone. Now I try to do 5 to 10, and I just let my curiosity take the interview where it goes, and it can go some pretty interesting places. And so that's something I've tried to adapt or try to implement as well over the last 100 episodes, and it's worked really, really well. So be a good listener and follow the conversation where it would go, and be curious. I mentioned that I have a lightning round, so I've developed this over time. I'm always adding questions to my lightning round questions, but it's just something fun that I can take leaders through at the end. And, I think about long-term, writing a book potentially from what I've learned from all of our guests and, talking about tricks and hacks and things like that. I can extract a ton of wisdom from all of the lightning rounds that we've had with leaders as well. So that's why I do the lightning rounds. And then I've already talked about at the end, make sure you ask for referrals and feedback, which I'll talk about, and just make sure you thank them for their time. And that would be all the interview tips that I have. And at the end, I already mentioned this, but I always ask for feedback. Always, 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 always. Especially if I'm interviewing someone that does podcast interviews all the time. I want to know, how can I get better and how can I separate myself from everyone else who's trying to do this? So over the course of doing interviews, I've had 4 leaders give me feedback that significantly changed everything for me. 2 of which I already talked about, that Matt Keller and Ken Coleman conversations, that changed everything for me. And then recently, John Gordon, I interviewed him, and I always started all of my interviews off with this question. I would say, hey, John, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. And John said, never ask that question again. And I said, why? Tell me more. And he said, because it's too broad and it throws people off and it makes them think of, how do I condense everything I do into one? And he said, just start with asking them about something that they're interested in and something of their expertise. And so that's been a game changer. And then Jessica Jackley, so simple, but she just said, hey, it would have been helpful if you would have sent me more information about your audience on the front end. And so again, I know I mentioned to do this already, but it's something that I hadn't always done. So that is something that I'm now doing on a weekly basis, thanks to the feedback. But here's what I know, you'll never get the feedback you don't ask for. And so ask for feedback every single time. It'll help you get better. All right. So that's the interview. A few thoughts on promoting your podcast. This is me, promoted everywhere. I'm a promoter by nature. But here's what I know. I had a friend tell me, Doug Foster, he said, Doug, I saw you post about the podcast around 7 times before I actually clicked. And again, I don't know the actual data, but I believe there's something of, people have to hear a message 7 times before it actually sinks in. And so why not promote your content? I think Donald Trump said this. It's who I've heard it attributed to. He said, you could have the best product in the world, but if nobody knows about it, what good is it? And that's true, isn't it? You could have the best podcast in the world, but if nobody knows about your podcast, no one's going to know about it. No one's going to listen to it, and it's not going to add value to people. So for me, promote it everywhere. I talked a little bit about breaking down your content. So taking the long form content and then making micro content that you can use on social media. That's worked extremely well. You'll hear me often on the podcast ask for ratings and reviews. Again, I don't know everything about the algorithms, but I do know that does help reach more leaders through the different podcast platforms. So that's a great way to promote and get more reach on your podcast. But really, just put it out there. Don't be afraid to text it to friends. Hey, I had this conversation with a leader. I thought it would add value to your life, and ask people to share it. And so get yourself out there. Don't be afraid to promote your work to the world. It takes great courage to produce something and say, this is something I created. So just do that. So that's promoting. A few thoughts on monetizing your podcast. I would say, again, this goes back to the why. Do not make making money the goal of your podcast. That is not a strong why. You can make money podcasting, which is great, but it shouldn't be your goal. It shouldn't be your why. But your goal should be to add value to people. And here's what I know. If you add value to people, the money will come. The sponsors will come and all of those things. And so for me, this is something I'm still growing in. I've had podcasts for several years now. And so I just agree with 2 local leaders who are mentors in my life, and I love their businesses. And so they love the podcast. And so they sponsor on a monthly basis, and it's Henny Jewelers and Bear Tongue Advisors, and we love them. And so that's how I developed and monetized my podcast. I'm still learning more about that whole realm. And so, but I would encourage you, I promise you, if you Google how to monetize your podcast, if you want to learn more, you'll learn more than you could ever need to implement and actually start monetizing your podcast. But again, my big thing is make it an awesome podcast, add value to people, and the money will come. Last two things I want to talk to you about is try not to care about stats. This is extremely hard. Try not to care about stats. Don't compare your podcast with others, and enjoy the journey. I'll say it again. Try not to care about stats. Don't compare your podcast with others, and enjoy the journey. Here's what I know. You're human, right? You're going to care about the numbers. I'm in several podcast Facebook groups, and literally, like, it's funny. People will say, I refresh my podcast stats, 3 or 4 times a day to look at the numbers. And we've all been there. I've done that. I've certainly done that. And it's so easy to get enamored with the numbers. And is my podcast growing? How many people am I reaching? And this can actually be really, really unhealthy. For me, I've shared on the podcast in the fall of 2020, I had a mental breakdown, and I had a mental breakdown for multiple reasons. But one of them was unrealistic expectations of myself internally. And so when it came to podcasting or my platform or the people that I reach, for me, it's like I'm always comparing myself, or I was comparing the expectations I have of myself compared to Lewis Howes, who gets millions and millions of downloads per episode, or Dave Ramsey, or Tim Ferriss. And I would say, hey, it's great I'm reaching this many people, but I'm nothing. My podcast is nothing until I'm at the Carey Nieuwhof level, which just isn't true. And God really, really dealt with me. I was on a walk in December, and he just really dealt with me. Stop looking at the numbers. Stop caring about the numbers. And he said, Doug, you can't compare yourself to other people. All you have to know is who you're impacting. That's it. If I've called you to create a podcast, which I believe God has, then every podcast I create is a step of obedience. And whether one person listens to it or 10,000 do, that one listen can change everything and can transform someone's life. And it could be the whole reason God told me to start the podcast. And so again, this goes back to your why. Your why has to be to add value to people. And again, I'm a person of faith. I'm a person of faith. And so that's just who I am. And so obviously I view things through a spiritual lens. But I love what I heard John Maxwell say once. He said this. He said, if God wants to make you a name, let him do that. If God wants to make you a name, let him do that. And that is just so profound, because here's what I know. If God wants you to have billions of downloads, you'll have billions of downloads. If God wants you to have millions, the numbers don't matter. If God wants to make you a name, he'll make you a name. All that matters is that if God's called you to create a podcast and you feel like you're supposed to, all that matters is that you do it, whether it reaches 1 or 1 million. Stop comparing, stop comparing, stop comparing. And, if you need help with that, think about the people that you have impacted. Think about it. If people have reached out to you and say, hey, I listened to that. That really helped me. That really helped me. Do you know how awesome that is, that you impacted one person's life? And just enjoy the journey. Enjoy your journey. It's a blast to add value to people and to get to connect with people on the podcast. Podcasting is a ton of fun, and it's a lot more fun when you don't spend all of your time worrying about the numbers, comparing yourself to others, etc. And the last thing I would tell you when it comes to podcasting is be consistent and don't quit. Be consistent and don't quit. If you've been listening to me for any amount of time, you've probably heard me share this quote. It's my favorite quote. Day-to-day intensity, week-to-week consistency builds champions. And that's the same way a great podcast is built. Day-to-day intensity, week-to-week consistency builds great podcasts, I would tell you. And, again, don't worry about the numbers. If you feel like you're called to podcast, keep podcasting. If you were to look at my stats for the podcast, for the first few years, this was my listenership. And then after a certain amount of time, it started going like this. And it's been gradual growth over time. And here's what I know. You're one episode away from changing the trajectory of your podcast growth. So keep being consistent. Unless you really feel like you're supposed to end your podcast, don't quit because you're discouraged. Just keep focusing on making a difference. That's the only thing that you're supposed to do every day when you wake up, is add value to people. So keep doing that. And here's what I know. If you'll just keep being faithful and keep showing up, you'll outlast everyone else who isn't. I already shared earlier in the podcast, out of hundreds of thousands of podcasts started every year, many of them never make it past 10 episodes. So if you do, you're among the few that do. So keep being faithful and keep making an impact. And so that's all of the advice I would give you when it comes to podcasting. I'm sure I left some things out. So if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to me. But I hope that it will encourage you to start a podcast. If you already have a podcast, I hope I gave you some useful insights of something that you could probably do better than you're already doing now. And I hope that I've encouraged you to keep going no matter what. I hope that you won't be discouraged. I hope that you'll keep making a difference and keep leading. Why? I say it every episode, because the world needs your leadership. And in this episode, they also need your podcast. Go get them. I'll talk to you next episode. It was a joy being with you today. Well, hey, leader, thank you so much for listening to my lesson on podcasting. I hope it added value to your life. You can find links to everything that I discussed in the show notes at l3leadership.org/308. And leader, I always want to challenge you that if you want to 10x your growth this year, then you need to either launch or join an L3 Leadership Mastermind Group. Mastermind groups have been the greatest source of growth in my life over the last 5 years. And if you're unfamiliar with what they are, they're just groups of 6 to 12 leaders that meet together on a consistent basis for at least 1 year in order to help each other grow, hold each other accountable, and to do life together. So if you're interested in learning more about masterminds, go to l3leadership.org/masterminds. And as always, I like to end every episode with a quote, and I'll quote Craig Groeschel today, and he said this. He said, "God did not call us to be important. He called us to be faithful." I'll say it one more time. God didn't call us to be important. He called us to be faithful. I hope this episode encouraged you, leader. Remember, keep leading. The world needs your leadership. Laura and I love you, and we'll talk to you next episode.